There's something happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, something that's exposing Iran's entire defensive doctrine, a doctrine built over decades, designed to turn this narrow 33 nautical mile strait into a death trap for any fleet that dares to enter. And the most remarkable part isn't what Iran has done, it's what Iran claims to have done, and the gap between the two shows exactly where they stand in this war. On May 4, 2026, the U.S. officially launched Project Freedom, the mission to bring warships into Hormuz to escort neutral nations' merchant ships that had been trapped for months in the Persian Gulf out to sea. That same day, USS Truxtun and USS Mason sailed straight through the strait under Iranian fire. Fast attack boats, missiles, drones, a sustained barrage that U.S. officials called a sustained barrage. No ships were hit. At the same time, USS Abraham Lincoln, a Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carrier carrying nearly 90 aircraft, on station in the Arabian Sea alongside USS George H.W. Bush in the first time two carrier strike groups have appeared together in CENTCOM since the conflict erupted, continued normal flight operations, and Iran claimed to have hit it with 2 ballistic missiles. U.S. CENTCOM responded with one word, lie. 3 events, same day, same strait. Each event is a layer of the same story, the story of 3 parallel wars playing out in Hormuz, a military war that Iran is losing on technical terms, an information war that Iran is trying to prolong at all costs, and a geopolitical war where the whole world is choosing sides very carefully. Stay with me, because when you understand the logic operating behind each layer, you'll see why every missile fired, every statement made, and every merchant ship successfully crossing the strait is reshaping the world order in ways no newspaper can capture in a single headline. Let's begin. On the morning of May 4, 2026, Trump posted on Truth Social an announcement. America would send warships into the Strait of Hormuz to escort neutral nations' merchant ships trapped for months in the Persian Gulf out to sea, many of them running low on food and supplies for crews of thousands. Those people are not Iranian, not American, they are neutrals caught in a war that isn't theirs. He called it Project Freedom. U.S. CENTCOM followed with an official statement. Project Freedom would deploy 15,000 troops, over 100 aircraft ashore and at sea, guided missile destroyers, and multi-domain drones operating in the air, on the surface, and underwater. Admiral Brad Cooper called it an essential mission for regional security and the global economy, while affirming that the naval blockade of Iranian ports would continue in parallel. On the first day, 2 U.S.-flagged merchant ships successfully crossed the strait. The Maersk Alliance Fairfax, one of the ships trapped since the first day of Operation Epic Fury back at the end of February, finally escaped the Persian Gulf after many months. When Iran retaliated by attacking a South Korean cargo ship, Trump posted on Truth Social, "We have shot down 7 small boats," then called on South Korea to join Project Freedom. But to understand why Project Freedom was designed that way, at that scale, at that moment, you need to step back further, back to Operation Epic Fury. When the campaign ended its main phase, 158 Iranian warships had been sunk. Trump declared the Iranian Navy wiped out, lying at the bottom of the sea. The U.S. dropped 5,000-pound bunker-buster bombs on Iranian coastal missile positions along Hormuz. 16 Iranian minesweeping vessels were sunk while performing their duties. The entire Iranian submarine fleet was destroyed. On paper, it was an overwhelming military victory. But this is what overwhelming victories sometimes fail to do. They do not erase the loser's will. Iran lost the ability to confront conventional naval forces, but they still had one thing that warships and submarines are not a prerequisite for using: mines and geographic control. Hormuz is only 33 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. Oman lies on the opposite shore, but Muscat has no significant naval force to be present or respond. Their territorial waters are exploited by Iran without counterbalance. Iran sows mines, controls the shipping lanes, pushes merchant ships close to their shore, and suddenly, one of the world's most important maritime routes is frozen not by a fleet, but by ambiguity and fear. Hundreds of oil tankers and cargo ships sit motionless at anchor. Oil prices exceed $100 per barrel. Inflation spreads globally. A quarter of the world's oil, plus significant volumes of fuel and essential fertilizers for global agriculture, all passing through this strait, suddenly fail to reach their destinations. So why didn't the US enter the strait earlier? The answer lies in a simple military principle. You don't bring high-value assets into confined space when the enemy controls the surrounding geography. Inside the Persian Gulf, US warships are within range of Iranian coastal missiles, within reach of IRGC fast attack boats, in uncleared minefields. Before Project Freedom, US destroyers entered the strait only once, on April 11th, to check for mines, once, in many months. That tells you how highly the US assessed the risk there. But accumulating global economic pressure was enough to change that calculation. There's one more thing to understand about the legal and political context of Project Freedom. It was born in a paradox. Trump declared a ceasefire from April 7th, extended multiple times, and wrote to Congress affirming that hostilities have ended. But the naval blockade of Iranian ports continued. Iran views Project Freedom as a ceasefire violation. Sending warships into waters they claim to control is an act of hostility by Tehran's definition. Washington views the blockade as a legitimate economic pressure tool, not a military action. Two definitions of ceasefire cannot coexist, and that very gap is the ground from which all the clashes on May 4 arose. As for the battlefield geometry of Project Freedom, this is a detail analysts rarely mention, but is of utmost importance. USS Lincoln and USS George H.W. Bush did not enter the strait. They maintained distance in the Arabian Sea, outside the effective range of most of Iran's remaining anti-ship weapons. Destroyers entered the strait, smaller, more maneuverable, protected by Apache and F-16 air support from above. The strike groups kept heavy firepower at range, ready to intervene within minutes if needed. This is not caution, this is design. By keeping the two carriers outside the strait, the US preserves immediate escalation capability. If fighting breaks out again, double the air power ready within an hour. Iran knows this. Every nation watching knows this. And that is exactly the message Project Freedom wants to send, not only to Tehran, but to all those observing whether America truly controls the world's most important international shipping lane or not. Now let's talk about what many people overlook when reading news about Hormuz. Let's look at what actually happened. The IRGC announced that 2 ballistic missiles had hit the USS Abraham Lincoln near Bandar Ajask after the ship ignored a stop warning, as if a Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carrier would stop because an IRGC fast attack boat ordered it to. Fars News, the IRGC's information arm, not an independent news agency by any definition, immediately amplified this claim. Al Jazeera broadcast it, and here's the notable detail. They called the Lincoln a frigate, a small escort ship, instead of an aircraft carrier, and cited the IRGC's statement before citing US CENTCOM's rebuttal. That was an editorial choice, not a mistake. Mohsen Rezai, former IRGC commander, advisor to Supreme Leader Khamenei, escalated at another level by declaring that Hormuz would become the graveyard of carriers and troops, and calling the US a pirate nation. The IRGC officially set a 30-day deadline for the US to lift the blockade, declaring it would turn the strait into a deadly trap for US warships if the demand was not met. And then, while the Iranian information ecosystem was operating at full capacity, an account on X posted a warning in the name of General Hatami, commander of Iran's armed forces, that every inch of this sea is under our control, and that cruise missiles and combat drones have taken off. Fars News, precisely Fars News, then had to admit this was a fake account. Let's pause on that detail for a moment, because it says a lot. When the IRGC's own information arm has to correct a statement posted in the name of a high-ranking general, it shows that Iran's information ecosystem is operating under enough pressure to lose control even of its own narrative. US CENTCOM responded to the entire charade with one sentence: lie. The Lincoln was not hit. The missile's launch didn't even come close. The Lincoln continued launching aircraft normally, so why did Iran do this? Not because they thought the whole world would believe it. The answer lies in the fact that this statement was not designed for one audience. It was designed for 2 completely different audiences, with 2 completely different goals, and neither goal had anything to do with convincing Americans or Westerners. The first goal is domestic. After Operation Epic Fury, the Iranian people are seeing real losses. 158 warships sunk, the entire submarine fleet wiped out, military infrastructure devastated by bunker-buster bombs, and now foreign warships moving through waters that their government claims to control. Accumulated discontent long enough will turn into protests, and protests large enough will threaten the regime's survival. The narrative, "we hit an American aircraft carrier," doesn't need to be believed by the whole world. It only needs to be believed by enough Iranians to keep morale from collapsing completely. It is an internal political dose, not a declaration of war. The second goal is Europe. Iran needs European countries, especially those with economic interests tied to oil flows through Hormuz, to continue believing that this conflict is not settled, that the US is taking losses, that supporting Washington is a costly choice rather than a given. If Europe believes Iran still has the ability to inflict significant damage on the US Navy, diplomatic pressure on Washington will increase, and negotiating space will open up. That is why Al Jazeera, with its enormous European and Middle Eastern audience, was the chosen amplification channel, not a Russian or Chinese outlet. As for the IRGC's 30-day deadline, don't mistake that for a real ultimatum. A real ultimatum comes with clear consequences and enforceability. Iran set a 30-day deadline not because they have plans for major escalation on day 31, but because that deadline buys them 30 days of diplomatic space, creates the sense that they are still controlling the pace of the conflict, and sets up a propaganda trap. If the US doesn't withdraw, Iran can claim before any next action that we warned them. It is the architecture of deliberate ambiguity, and here is the final detail that few notice but is the most important. This is not the first time Iran has used this tactic. March 2026, right in the early days of Operation Epic Fury, Iran had already claimed to hit the USS Abraham Lincoln with ballistic missiles. CENTCOM denied it in the same language. Lie. Now it is May, and the script repeats exactly the same ship, the same claim, the same rebuttal, the same amplification channels. When a tactic repeats exactly, it is no longer an improvised reaction. It is a playbook, tested, refined, and deliberately deployed every time Iran needs a propaganda victory to compensate for what is happening on the ground. But before talking about why Iran failed technically on that day, let's talk about what Iran actually has, because this is where many commentators make mistakes in two opposite directions, either exaggerating Iran's remaining capabilities to create a sense of drama, or dismissing them entirely because Iran has lost 158 warships. Both are wrong. Iran is not left with nothing, and what they have left is being used, right on May 4, simultaneously at multiple different targets, in a way that shows this is a calculated tactical doctrine rather than desperate reaction. USS Truxtun and USS Mason crossed Hormuz under an attack that US officials described as a sustained barrage, fast attack boats closing in from multiple directions, shore-launched missiles, drones flying in waves. At the same time, to the north, Iran launched missiles and drones at the United Arab Emirates. Oil facilities in Fujairah caught fire after a suspected drone attack. And while Project Freedom was underway, a South Korean cargo ship, completely unrelated to the US-Iran conflict, was attacked by Iran, prompting Trump to post on Truth Social calling on Seoul to join the mission. 3 targets, 3 types of weapons, 3 different locations within the same time frame. That is not random action. That is doctrine. These attacks originated from Bandar Jask, Iran's southernmost naval base, located right next to the Gulf of Oman, just outside the entrance to the strait. Jask's geographic position is why it is so important. Iran can launch weapons at convoys at the southern entrance of Hormuz without its own ships having to leave protected waters, without facing US forces directly on the sea. Mobile launchers, familiar coastline, short distance to targets. But Jask is also its own deadly weakness, and we will talk about that in the next part. First, understand the arsenal Iran is using. The C-802 Noor anti-ship cruise missile, derived from Chinese technology, range about 100 nautical miles, flies low over the sea at low altitude to avoid radar. This is a weapon that has been combat-proven. In 2006, Hezbollah used a similar version to hit the Israeli corvette INS Hanat off Lebanon. It is not a toy. Improved ballistic missiles for maritime targets. This is the hardest type to intercept in Iran's arsenal because of its extremely high speed in the final phase of its trajectory when it dives toward the target. Accuracy against moving sea targets is significantly lower than against fixed land targets, but if it gets through the defenses, the impact energy is devastating. HY-2 Silkworm, a Cold War-era coastal system, old, slower than modern missiles, but still carrying a warhead large enough to cause serious damage if not intercepted. Iran still maintains Silkworm launchers along the coast because their cost is nearly zero and because in a salvo attack, even old weapons consume expensive interceptor ammunition from the opponent. Shahed drones, this is the weapon Iran has exported to Russia, used to devastate Ukraine's power infrastructure, and is now being launched at the UAE and neutral commercial ships. Each one costs less than $20,000. Each U.S. interceptor missile costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. That is the economic calculation Iran is trying to exploit. And IRGC fast attack boats, their numbers have decreased significantly after Operation Epic Fury, but those remaining are still extremely maneuverable in the narrow spaces of the strait, can carry missiles and torpedoes, and are hard to detect early by radars designed to track larger targets. Now let's look at the doctrine that combines all those weapons. Iran no longer hopes to defeat the U.S. Navy in a direct confrontation. They lost that ability when Operation Epic Fury ended. Their doctrine now is different. Launch enough things from enough directions at the same time so that at least one gets through. Fast attack boats closing in from the sea, low-flying cruise missiles from shore, ballistic missiles from above, drones from another direction. Each threat requires a different response, consuming different interceptor resources. If the defense system is busy handling this threat, it might be a little slower with that threat. That is the theory. But May 4 showed that theory has important structural limits that Iran apparently still hasn't found a way to overcome. And the attack on the UAE was not a random action in this picture. It was a calculated strategic escalation. Iran is not only targeting the U.S. because they know they cannot reliably inflict direct damage on U.S. ships. Instead, they are targeting the energy infrastructure of America's partners. The UAE, one of the countries allowing the U.S. to use its territory and airspace. The logic is very clear. If Gulf states have to pay a price for supporting Washington, they will start reconsidering that level of cooperation. Fujairah burning is not a message to the U.S. Navy. It is a message to Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and every Gulf capital watching. The cost of standing with the U.S. is real, tangible, and will continue. But the actual combat results on May 4 are the clearest evidence of the structural limits of Iran's doctrine. A sustained barrage, fast boats, missiles, drones, coordinated simultaneously, and not a single threat touched Truxtun or Mason. All were intercepted or destroyed. Iran's salvo doctrine was designed to overwhelm single-layer defenses, a lone destroyer with one radar system, one layer of interceptors, one potential point of failure. It was not designed to deal with what the U.S. actually deployed at Hormuz that day. So the system is really what and why does it turn everything Iran launches into an unsolvable problem? The answer begins not when the Iranian missiles are launched, but long before that, from the moment Iranian engineers are preparing the launchers at Jask, from the moment IRGC fast attack boats are assembling offshore, from the moment the guidance radars begin scanning. That is what most people do not understand about how the U.S. integrated kill chain operates. It does not begin when the threat appears. It begins before the threat knows it has been detected. In the Arabian Sea, the USS Abraham Lincoln, Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carrier CVN-72, with nearly 90 aircraft, was launching FA-18E SF Super Hornets and EA-18G Growlers continuously throughout May 4th, enforcing the blockade and supporting Project Freedom at the same time. U.S. Air Force F-16s, among more than 100 aircraft on land and sea that CENTCOM confirmed, were patrolling the skies above the strait. U.S. Army AH-64 Apaches flew close to the water, providing direct support to Truxtun and Mason while the two ships crossed the strait. MH-60R Seahawks, armed with AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, operated from the destroyer USS Thomas Hudner, sweeping the surface and subsurface for every approaching threat. And at the end of the day, Admiral Brad Cooper confirmed 6 Iranian fast attack boats had been destroyed. Those are the things visible from the outside, but what is not visible is far more important. Higher than all of that, the E-2D Hawkeye, airborne early warning aircraft with radar detection range of more than 400 miles, was painting the complete battlefield picture from an altitude that no Iranian low-altitude air defense system could reach. Every ship moving, every aircraft taking off, every radar turning on within a 400-mile radius appeared on the E-2D's screen in real time. Even higher, the RQ-4 Global Hawk, high-altitude reconnaissance drone, flying continuously at altitudes above 60,000 feet, beyond the reach of every remaining Iranian air defense system, was tracking every movement at Jask base and along the Iranian coastline. When a truck carrying a mobile launcher began moving into position, the Global Hawk saw it. When technicians began preparing missiles, the Global Hawk saw it. The F-35, stealthy, undetected by Iranian radar, flew closer in, supplementing high-resolution sensor data that the E-2D and Global Hawk could not provide. And all of it connected via Link 16, the encrypted tactical data network that links every U.S. platform in the area into a single information ecosystem. An F-16 pilot on land saw the same battlefield picture as the coordinator on the Lincoln. An Aegis engineer on Truxton saw the same target data as the Apache pilot flying close to the water. There were no information gaps. There was no significant latency. This is why the EA-18G Growler was the most important weapon that day that few mention. The Growler is not a fighter jet in the conventional sense. It is a dedicated electronic warfare platform, designed to do one thing with extreme sophistication: listen. Every radar operating in the area, every emission frequency, every electromagnetic signal from Iranian missile guidance systems. The Growler heard it all and located the source with enough precision to attack. When the guidance radar for the C-802 Noor turned on at Jask, the Growler did not just detect it, it precisely located the coordinates, passed it immediately via Link 16 to F-18s, F-35s, A-10s, F-15Es, and that launcher became a target before the next salvo could even be loaded. That is the feedback loop Iran has no answer for. Every time they turn on a radar to guide a missile, they reveal their own position. Turn off the radar and the missile loses guidance. Turn on the radar and the launcher becomes a target. There is no third option. And with the fast attack boats, this is where the Apaches and Seahawks showed their role. The AH-64 Apache was designed for land battlefields, but in the confined space of the Strait of Hormuz, it became the ideal weapon against small, highly maneuverable boats, flying low, agile, spotting targets with the naked eye before firing, armed with rockets, Hellfire missiles, and a 30mm cannon with a rate of fire enough to rip apart the thin steel hulls of IRGC fast attack boats. The MH-60R Seahawk from USS Thomas Hudner added another layer of surface and anti-submarine defense. The Seahawk's AGM-114 Hellfires could destroy small boats from a safe distance before they got close enough to launch torpedoes or ram. The result: 6 Iranian fast attack boats destroyed. The rest withdrew. And all of that was the outer layer of defense, before anything got close enough to trigger Aegis. The Aegis system on Arleigh Burke destroyers is why Iran's salvo doctrine failed even in theory when facing this configuration. A single Arleigh Burke can track more than 100 targets simultaneously, missiles, drones, small boats, aircraft, and prioritize intercepts in real time without waiting for human orders. SM-6 intercepts at long range when the threat is still dozens of miles away. SM-2 intercepts at medium range as backup if the SM-6 misses. And if both are not enough, something that is almost impossible against a single target, the CIWS Phalanx is the final layer, a 20mm Gatling gun firing 4,500 rounds per minute, fully automatic, no human needed in the decision loop, detecting and firing in a fraction of a second. To penetrate this defensive structure, Iran would need to defeat not just one layer, but all layers simultaneously: E-2D, Global Hawk, F-35, Growler, Apache, Seahawk, SM-6, SM-2, Phalanx, in seconds, under counterfire, with the weapons left after already losing 158 warships. And CENTCOM had one more layer, rarely mentioned in all the commentary about Hormuz: multi-domain, unmanned platforms operating underwater, on the surface and in the air, multi-domain unmanned platforms in CENTCOM's official language. The potential to equip microwave technology to neutralize Shahed drones before they reach Gulf partner energy infrastructure without expending expensive interceptor missiles on each cheap drone. This is the reverse asymmetry Iran has no answer for. They designed salvo tactics to overwhelm the US with numbers and low cost, but the US integrated kill chain turns every Iranian weapon launched into coordinates for a counterstrike, creating a feedback loop where every time Iran attacks, Iran loses more assets. The result on May 4 was not luck. It was real-world validation of a system designed precisely for this scenario. But the technical war is only one of 3 layers of what is happening at Hormuz. The most complex layer is not the one with missiles and drones, but the one with foreign ministers, oil contracts, and geopolitical calculations. The UK, France, and Germany did not directly support the US naval blockade. Instead, all 3 proposed an alternative multinational mission, a mechanism to reopen Hormuz without officially standing behind Washington. Macron went further, calling for a comprehensive diplomatic solution that includes 3 pillars: reopening Hormuz, a regional security agreement, and simultaneously addressing 3 Iranian threats: the nuclear program, ballistic missile capabilities, and regional activities through proxies. It sounds comprehensive and responsible, but to understand why Europe is in that position, you have to understand what lies beneath that stance, and it is not primarily about values or diplomatic principles. Brent crude futures, the standard crude oil contract for the entire international oil market, are traded in London. Every barrel of oil moving through Hormuz is tied to liquidity, transaction fees, and contract volume in the London financial market. When Hormuz is blockaded, it is not just oil prices that rise. The entire financial trading structure built on the assumption of stable oil flow through that strait is disrupted. A prolonged blockade is not a geopolitical issue for London. It is a measurable financial revenue issue. But here is what is more important to understand. Iran did not buy Europe's silence with direct bribes or any secret deals. Iran maintains that silence by maintaining sufficiently stable oil flows for decades, to the point that Europe has built its entire financial, energy, and trade structure dependent on the stability of that status quo. When the status quo is broken, whether by Iran or by the US, Europe suffers real financial damage. And the natural reflex of any party suffering financial damage is to want to restore the status quo, not fundamentally change it. That is why Europe's position sounds more like a call for de-escalation than support for maximum pressure. But Europe's strategic contradiction in this crisis runs deeper than the oil issue, and it is converging on a point where 2 of their goals cannot coexist. Europe wants oil to flow. Europe does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. For decades, those 2 goals could be managed in parallel because Iran was not close enough to the nuclear threshold to force a choice. But US intelligence just assessed that the military campaign Operation Epic Fury only caused limited damage to Iran's nuclear program. Tehran still has time. That means every month of delay, every week Europe prioritizes restoring oil flows over maintaining maximum pressure, is additional time Iran uses to move closer to the threshold, where the question is no longer, what can Iran do, but what does Iran already have? As for Trump rejecting Iran's 14-point peace plan and declaring that Iran has not yet paid enough for 47 years of what they have done to humanity and the world, that is not angry language or impulsive talk. That is language with architecture. Accepting a seat at the negotiating table while Iran is still blockading Hormuz is to acknowledge something extremely dangerous, that economic blockade is a legitimate lever that can be traded for diplomatic concessions. Once that precedent is created, every state or non-state actor in the world capable of disrupting a critical maritime choke point learns that doing so will be rewarded with concessions. Washington refuses to create that precedent. And the mention of 47 years is not rage. It is reframing the entire conflict into a much longer story, refusing to limit the scope of negotiations to the current Hormuz crisis, and signaling that Washington's goal is not just to reopen the strait. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are navigating a problem with no clean solution. The UAE was directly attacked, oil facilities in Fujairah caught fire, an attack on their economic infrastructure right on their own territory. Abu Dhabi strongly condemned it and stated it reserves the full and legitimate right to respond, but they have not taken military action. Saudi Arabia called for de-escalation. Both are stuck in a position they cannot escape by staying silent or by speaking too loudly, supporting the US too clearly, and they become the next target in Iran's expanded front doctrine. Staying silent too long, and they send a signal to Washington that American security guarantees are not reliable enough to build regional policy around. The diplomatic channel through Pakistan is still maintained. This is the safety valve for both sides, enough to avoid uncontrolled escalation, but not enough to create a real breakthrough. There is a structural deadlock. Washington wants concessions before talking. Tehran wants the blockade lifted before conceding. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said there is no military solution to the political crisis, and technically, he is not wrong. But that sentence is read very differently depending on who is reading it. To Europe, it sounds like a call for negotiations. To Washington, it sounds like an admission that Iran cannot win militarily and is looking for a diplomatic exit while preserving face. And all of that leads to May 8, the deadline Iran set for itself to reassess the ceasefire. Do not mistake this for preparation for full-scale military escalation. A regime that has lost 158 warships, its entire submarine fleet, and just witnessed the U.S. integrated kill chain destroy 6 fast attack boats in a single day does not have many options for real military escalation. May 8 is a diplomatic bargaining point, a self-imposed deadline to create pressure at the negotiating table, force the parties to send signals before that date, and if no concessions appear, allow Iran to carry out an action strong enough to present to its domestic population, but not large enough to trigger a full-scale military response from Washington. That is the optimization problem of a regime that needs to survive politically at home while finding a way out of a conflict it is losing on every technical front. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because what is happening at Hormuz is not just about oil, not just about Iran, and certainly not just about 33 nautical miles of narrow water between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. This is a statement about who controls international maritime lanes in the 21st century, and every major power watching understands that, even if no one says it out loud. China is silent in a calculated way. 80% of Beijing's imported oil passes through Hormuz. No Chinese policymaker can look at that number and feel comfortable with a third party controlling that route, whether that third party is Iran or the US. Beijing cannot publicly support Iran without harming its own energy supply, cannot support the US without acknowledging strategic dependence on the US Navy, and cannot remain silent forever without an answer to the question, what if this happens in the South China Sea? Russia is observing the operational model, not the weapons, but the model, a superpower imposing a naval blockade, maintaining it under ballistic missile fire, and continuing to expand the scope while the integrated kill chain handles every counterattack. 80% of Beijing's imported oil passes through Hormuz. No Chinese policymaker can look at that number and feel comfortable with a third party controlling that route, whether that third party is Iran or the US. Beijing cannot publicly support Iran without harming its own energy supply, cannot support the US without acknowledging strategic dependence on the US Navy, and cannot remain silent forever without an answer to the question, what if this happens in the South China Sea? Russia is observing the operational model, not the weapons, but the model. A superpower imposing a naval blockade, maintaining it under ballistic missile fire, and continuing to expand the scope while the integrated kill chain handles every counterattack. The question Moscow is asking itself is not whether the US can do this to Iran. The answer is already clear. The question is, where else can this model be reapplied, and does Russia have enough capability to break it? But there is one warning few noticed in all the May 4 news. Experts at the Hudson Institute pointed out that both the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush have extended deployments beyond plan, and that is creating the risk of cascading delays in maintenance at the Norfolk and Puget Sound shipyards. The consequence, by 2027 and 2028, the U.S. Navy may have difficulty maintaining more than 2 carrier strike groups deployed simultaneously. That is the hidden cost of maintaining maximum pressure, and it is information that Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow are all reading very carefully. May 8 is approaching. Iran set a deadline for itself, and a regime that has lost 158 warships, its entire submarine fleet, witnessed its nuclear program suffer only limited damage, but still not enough to change the situation, does not have many real options at the table. But a regime that needs to survive politically at home also cannot back down without something to present to its people. That is a contradiction that cannot be solved with missiles or drones, and that is why the coming days at Hormuz will be decided not on the sea, but in meeting rooms we are not allowed to see. Follow us for updates on all further developments. If analyses like this are valuable to you, please hit subscribe right now, because we will continue to follow every development of Hormuz and every conflict reshaping the world order, and we do not want you to miss anything. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next video.